Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the US Capitol building. If you've joined us today for the insurrection, please make sure you pick up a promotional leaflet on the way in, stay inside the safety cordons at all times, and if you get lost, speak to one of our Capitol police officers. They'll be sure to point you in the right direction.
Hey internets, so this video is just going to be refuting some additional bad takes which make the heavily exaggerated claim that the January 6th Capitol riot, or as I like to call it, the Great Q Boomer Freakout of 2021, can be reasonably called an insurrection. Now, last week I've seen a lot of bad faith arguments in regards to the January 6th question, and even more since I released my own video on it. So I'm just kind of releasing this as a follow-up to that previous video on Muh insurrection. And I've decided that going forward I should probably more often be doing this, making follow-up videos shortly after I put out either a Muh video or one of my more high-effort content, just to go over any additional details, refute anything additionally, or clear up any misconceptions, or in the case of this video, refuting those additional bad takes. Once again, I'd like to preface everything though with the should-be-obvious disclaimer that this video comes with strong condemnation of political violence and does not condone the actions that took place in this event. I am only arguing that it is not an insurrection, but I am not trying to exploit or make light of the subject or argue that it's a good thing. I mean, honestly, it should be pretty obvious I don't condone political violence. This is a libertarian channel after all, but the YouTube channel bano demonetizo delete your channel bot tends to dislike the subject on January 6th, so I need to make it extra explicitly clear that I am not advocating for random mobs attacking the Capitol. Anyway, with the fluff out of the way, I'd like to start with where a lot of these takes are going to come from, which is that 3-hour Zero Hedge debate with Destiny, Alex Jones, Glenn Greenwald, and Darren Beatty, and I guess the Krasenstein brothers as well. And I'll just be blunt, it wasn't a very good debate overall. In the 3-hour span, there was way too much shouting over each other coming from Destiny and Alex Jones, which often derailed the topic to be about things that aren't even related to January 6th in any way. At one point, the moderator even had to step in and explain to them that the way they were acting and the way that they were going off on tangents was causing the entire debate to be pretty much unwatchable and really boring people because they weren't able to stay on topic the whole time. You can watch the 3-hour debate anyway if you want to. I will be including a link in the description below. Just don't say I didn't warn you that the entire thing is a little bit boring, and I only forced myself to watch it for the sake of finding additional arguments in regards to January 6th. I would have preferred it to have been entertaining, but unfortunately it was not. Anyways, I would like to first go over the additional goalpost shifting on the definition of insurrection on the part of Destiny. The main central point I was making in my Muh insurrection video is that the problem with those who are trying to call it an insurrection is that they are equivocating and constantly shifting the goalpost on just what specifically an insurrection is. Is an insurrection a serious armed uprising to overthrow or replace the US government or any government? Or is it just simply disrupting the peaceful transfer of power? One of these obviously paints a much harsher picture than the other, so by shifting between the two definitions, they can try and demand recompense as if something that met the harsher definition occurred while using the softer definition, which is not valid reasoning at all. Now, in the case of January 6th, they want to treat it as if it's just as harsh as what people were considering when the 14th Amendment was written, while at the same time using a much broader definition of insurrection that they basically just made up over 150 years after said amendment was created. Yeah, it's really silly. Now, Destiny is one of those people who sits more towards the left of things, who is capable of occasionally making good faith intelligent arguments, but unfortunately I do not believe this is the case with his takes on January 6th, because when he was called out on how his definitions weren't really adding up, he has, since the recording of my video, shifted the goalpost on what an insurrection is even more. So for instance, in the Zero Hedge debate, around 2 hours and 45 minutes in, Destiny had his new definition of what an insurrection or a coup is, which is, a coup is when you enact a scheme to try to circumvent the peaceful transfer of power, at which point he was immediately met with pushback when one of them said, like Russiagate. And that's kind of the general problem with using these softball definitions of what an insurrection is in an attempt to prove your point. It ends up being the nuclear option. You end up painting a lot of things that you probably wouldn't consider to be a coup as a coup, along with whatever you're actually trying to paint as a coup. Again, like Russiagate would probably be a good example. Most people who lean politically left in any way probably wouldn't consider Russiagate to be a coup, but based on the definition that Destiny just gave, it absolutely was a coup. Similar issues could also arise from the Antifa and BLM riots, since you could easily argue that they had a scheme to cause enough civil unrest to limit the Trump administration, or even demand a re-election under, again, the pretense that the 2016 election was stolen because, again, Russia. Now, enough people pointed this out to him that he then later shifted the goalpost once more on his definition to it being a coherent plot to overthrow the government, and therefore the other riots don't count. And I actually replied to him and pointed this problem out. When you shift the goalpost once once more to it now being a coherent plot to overthrow the government, well, the January 6th riots at the Capitol don't fit that definition either. And he would later cope about this further by complaining that it's a Muh Whataboutism or appeal to hypocrisy. But the thing is, that's completely missing the point. Me personally, I don't think the January 6th riots were an insurrection, and I don't think that BLM or Antifa were trying to do an insurrection either. I see all of them as wrong, but none of them can honestly be called an insurrection. But what I believe about them doesn't matter, because the entire point is the logical inconsistency. You can't scream Muh appeal to hypocrisy when you are trying to say that X is Y thing because of your given definition Z, and someone points out how W would also fall under Y thing based on your given definition Z, when you don't believe W is Y thing. The point there isn't a tu quoque fallacy. The point is that anyone who does this is contradicting themselves on definition Z. It's not so much an attack on you as a person, it's just pointing out that your definition Z is a bad definition and doesn't make any sense, and they're showing that to you by showing you examples that you wouldn't even agree on your own definition. That is a completely valid argument. In fact, it's something I somewhat pointed out in my very first Muh video, which was Muh Whataboutism. Whataboutism has two forms. One of them is a tu quoque and is fallacious. There is a fallacious form of whataboutism when it's trying to specifically be a red herring, as well as a tu quoque. However, it's entirely reasonable to bring up some whataboutism when it comes to ideological inconsistency, because it shows that an ideology or position isn't actually willing to defend itself on the principles it claims to have, and therefore cannot be taken seriously by anyone who's trying to maintain even the tiniest shred of intellectual honesty. And that pretty much sums up the problem that a lot of people have with the January 6th issue, is that it can really only be called an insurrection without accidentally calling a bunch of other silly things an insurrection if you are willing to be completely inconsistent on what exactly specifically an insurrection or coup is. Now, the next thing I want to point out was actually something that came from the Krasensteins about 5 minutes into the Zero Hedge debate, which is that he's saying it was an insurrection because 20 court decisions called it an insurrection, and that bills were passed in the Senate calling them a mob of insurrectionists, as well as a statute awarding police officers medals like the good little doggies they were, and referring to the event as an insurrection. Now, I'm not some supreme legal expert here, but even I know enough to know that there's a really big difference between a court decision and actually being charged and found guilty of something in a trial where the other side is given a chance to provide evidence to the contrary. It didn't specify which ones he was talking about, but most likely he was referring to the cases like the Colorado Supreme Court calling it an insurrection. Cases like these are not trials. They are just people with authority saying what they believe and giving reasons for doing so. These do not involve anyone actually being found guilty of insurrection, and the standard of evidence is much, much lower, and the other side isn't really given a chance to make their case. Which means people in this type of court case with a partisan bias can pretty much argue and say anything, arguing for whatever the heck they want, making whatever claims they want. Same thing with politicians saying it was an insurrection. Same thing with some people in power handing medals to police officers and calling it an insurrection. None of this counts as conclusive proof that it's an insurrection. It's just people in positions of authority saying that they personally believe it was an insurrection. So the Krasenstein's argument here is really just a thinly veiled appeal to authority. Authority figure TM called it an insurrection, therefore it is an insurrection. Ding ding, brilliant. So yeah, that's definitely not a good argument. For clarification's sake though, what some people who took part in the riot have actually found to be guilty of is seditious conspiracy. Now, seditious conspiracy is a charge with a much, much, much broader range to it compared to accusing someone in taking part in a coup or insurrection. It can range from overthrowing the government, so that's in there, but it can also range in seriousness all the way down to simply conspiring to damage government property. So for example, conspiring to break windows in a state-owned building. Probably not something you should be doing, but also definitely not an insurrection. Now, next I want to touch on a few things that weren't necessarily fully discussed in the Zero Hedge debate, but I have seen flying around the internet and even in my own comments. Now, the first of these is that some people will just try to forget what happened on January 6th and admit, okay, that was just a riot, it wasn't really an insurrection. However, what Trump did outside of that was an insurrection. Now, this is probably the most intelligent argument to attempt to make, because it shows people realizing, okay, you're not going to define the January 6th riot as an insurrection. The evidence just isn't there, and the arguments for it involve way too much semantics, to the point where no one's ever going to agree on. But it is possible to say that some of the stuff that Trump did himself was wrong. The problem, though, is when I took a look at the stuff that Trump did, it's definitely sketchy, but none of it can really be called a coup. It was just Trump believing believing that the election was stolen from him, so he was overly aggressive in his contesting of the results, to the point where he was using every single possible legal tool at his disposal in an attempt to contest the results. For example, in the fake electors scheme, the evidence when brought to court seemed to show that the plan was those electors' votes would really only be taken seriously if Trump were to later prevail in court claiming election fraud, which obviously didn't happen. It seems the plan was, again, to contest the election and settle for a later court date rather than to actually overthrow the government. While you can definitely argue that Trump was wrong in doing this, the only way you can argue that this was a coup is to engage in some very serious mind reading. You have to think that Trump fully believed that he had lost fair and square, but did all this anyway, which, considering the fact that Trump is still harping on about it, this is probably not the case. To call it a coup anyways would set a really weird precedent where any contesting of election results in any context now counts as a possible insurrection. Democracy is already severely flawed enough. It certainly doesn't need an additional clause in it where you get punished for potential thought crimes of treason if you think an election wasn't conducted properly. And again, this would force Russiagate back into the table, as you are once again dealing with definitions of insurrection that are clerical and bureaucratic rather than violent, which just brings you back to January 6th. Without January 6th fitting the glove of being an insurrection, it's a really hard stretch to accuse Trump of engaging in insurrection either. So you kind of have to make January 6th out to be an insurrection to make that case. So on that note, that brings me to some additional arguments I saw that are worth pointing out that weren't really in the zero hedge debate. The first of these is that it's not relevant how many people take part in an insurrection in order for it to count as an insurrection. Therefore, comparing the numbers of the, say, Civil War to January 6th doesn't matter and doesn't make sense. The problem with this argument is that it's a nitpick that actually disproves its own point. Yes, it's technically correct that you could have a one-man coup attempt. It could totally happen. One absolutely crazy person out of their mind absolutely can storm the Capitol building in full body armor with multiple AR-15s or something strapped to his back, while dual-wielding pistols gunning down anyone who gets in his way like he was in some action movie or something after posting some schizoidal manifesto on, of course, everyone's favorite Chinese cartoon image boards about how he's totally going to single-handedly overthrow the US government. It would be, again, completely suicidal, and it's entirely possible that he wouldn't even take anyone down with him before he himself was taken out by any of the numerous guards they have around. And the event would just be seen as either a mass shooting tragedy or a nothing burger at the hands of a madman, depending on how far he got. But it would also technically fit the definition of an attempted coup, no matter how suicidal and stupid it would be for him to try that. But that just brings us back to the question then, okay, why did none of the 40,000 or so Trump supporters try to do anything remotely like this on January 6th? That's 40k chances for this dice roll of said crazy man to happen, and somehow it turned up a grand total of 0 times. Such insurrection, much wow. Some of them, at best, had concealed handguns and bear spray or whatever, but that's not beyond what you would expect a Trump supporter to be casually carrying on any given random day anyways, so that's a complete cope argument. The best people can come up with is maybe that one guy with zip ties, but come on now, you don't actually know what was going through his head. You're really starting to scrape the bottom of the barrel here. I saw another similar argument related to the same flawed logic as this, that the reason the Trump supporters didn't come to the Capitol with their AR-15s and basically coming in guns a-blazing like crazy people again is because that would have been suicidal. Yeah, no shit, Sherlock. That would have been suicidal. That's the point. An actual, real insurrection is a very, very, very serious thing, and this also comes with it being an extremely risky thing. To actually attempt an insurrection with a real goal of winning generally means putting your life on the line. Pointing this out doesn't prove that it was an insurrection. All it does is push it into unfalsifiable mind reading. Perhaps maybe some small handful of people at January 6th believed that they would be willing to go all the way, but none of them showed it. So again, we are really scraping the bottom of the barrel if we want to paint this as an insurrection. The fact that they weren't willing to put in that level of risk shows they most likely didn't really intend for it to be an insurrection. In fact, the video evidence shows that a large portion of the people in the Capitol that day didn't even want it to escalate to being a riot. They were just random Trumpies with their Trump signs showing their support. Whoop-de-freaking-do, such insurrection, much wow. What I personally suspect is going on here is that a lot of people fell for the propaganda and don't want to admit that they got bamboozled. After January 6th happened, tons of mainstream media, prestige-seeking cathedralite types crawled out of their little holes to call it an insurrection before the evidence could even come out, and in many cases before any court dates for those accused of wrongdoing had even been made. This irresponsible behavior is unfortunately pretty typical of modern clown world journalism. And what happens is a lot of midwit types will just accept this propaganda at face value, especially those still suffering from severe cases of Trump derangement syndrome. So then when the evidence later came out showing that no one could really be accused of insurrection and that all the video footage either showed behavior typical of what you would call a riot or typical of the biggest nothing burger ever in some cases, those who fell for that propaganda don't want to admit that they fell for it, so now they have to generate endless amounts of smart sounding but ultimately fallacious arguments for why it's an insurrection. And for that reason, I'm pretty much done with this topic. One of the problems with poor arguments is that you can generate an endless amount of them. 1 + 1 = X has one correct answer and an infinite possible number of incorrect answers. Anyone driven by motivated reasoning or isn't just in general being disingenuous can look at what happened between 2020 and 2021 in the election in the United States and find an endless amount of silly things to stretch and mold and equivocate on in order to try and make it seem like it was an insurrection. And I, for one, just don't feel like sitting here sniping down bad argument after bad argument after bad argument. So instead, I'm just going to conclude with this tweet from the blue-collar intellectual. Happy January 6th to everyone losing their minds. I've had sex more violent than this insurrection. Y'all are ridiculous for trying to take Trump off the ballot for this. That's all for now. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like, share, subscribe, or tip me on Ko-Fi or whatever, or just leave a comment for the algorithm. Till next time.